Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Data Revolution podcast. I'm Kate Carruthers, and this time my guest is Fiona Tweedie. She's been thinking about the need for explainable AI for a long time, and we had a fascinating chat on why this is important and why we should care about AI being explainable. We also talked about some of the risks and potential benefits associated with AI being explainable. A bit about Fiona. Fiona fell in love with the transformative power of data when working on the Australian Government's Principles on Open Public Sector Information, and has held numerous roles analysing, governing and wrangling data in the years since. She's worked on embedded ethical approaches to data in commercial and research organisations and is passionate about demystifying tech and increasing data literacy. She holds a PhD in ancient history. Historians are always good people, and is working on the blanket that she started crocheting during lockdown. Over to our conversation with Fiona Tweedie.
Mm-hmm.
Hello and welcome, Fiona. It's really great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So what topic are we going to talk about today?
I'd really like to talk about explainability of automated decisions and how we can create systems and processes that let people understand what decisions are being made about them and why, and give them opportunities to have input into that process.
That sounds kind of important, but why do you think this is important, and why should we care about this?
I think it's incredibly important for a couple of reasons. I think that we hear a lot of people talking about this idea of bias in AI, and that's a term that drives me a little bit crazy. I don't think bias is quite the right word there, but we know that large data sets that are collected from the world will reflect the unfairnesses that are in the world. For instance, they may reflect gender biases or racial biases that exist. So I think it's really important.
I think we've all seen those examples where if you search in a search engine for pictures of doctors, most of the pictures are male. So that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And when we know that there are these problems in the underlying data sets that are used for decision making, I think it's really important that we've got good ways to ask questions about what's gone into making a decision, and if somebody is disadvantaged by a decision, that they're given paths to question that and to ask for review. It kind of feeds back for me to the ideas of natural justice or procedural fairness, which says if a decision is made about somebody which relies on information from a third source, that person should have the opportunity to review that information and comment on it. So if I'm being turned down for a credit application or a job application based on computer says no, surely there should be a way for me to know why the computer says no, and maybe to refute or question the data that's gone into making that decision.
Yeah, that's a really important reason why we should care. So what are the key components that in your idea of how we should approach this? Like, how should we do this? I can't even imagine.
I think the first thing, I'm not sure either. I will say that.
We're kind of inventing this as we fly the plane, aren't we?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that goes in is you need to tell people when a decision is being made about them and when that decision is an automated one. I think we can have some proportionality there. I think depending on the effect of that decision on them, we get recommendations all the time fed to us based on previous activity. So it's not...
So this is kind of the difference between an Amazon recommendation, which is based on data that has little impact on your life, to one for a job or a loan or something that can have major impact on your life.
Yes. I think really we should focus on those decisions that will have significant or can have significant impact on people's lives. That we need to tell them that these decisions are being made, and in the event that the outcome is not the one they were hoping for, I think, and this is where it gets really, really hard, but creating opportunities for people to ask for review, to have human review of a decision, and as much as possible showing people the basis for the decision and allowing them to respond. So my first job as a shiny grad at NAB was looking at home loans and home loan applications. And we had this program called Decision Tools. And in the event that Decision Tools said no to a loan application, it would come down to us in the credit team. And there'd be this whole process of a conversation with the borrower about why the computer had said no. And often it was to do with somebody's credit history being a bit patchy. And so they would write us a letter and explain why they had not paid their phone bill on time. And so I guess with that experience, I'm thinking about how do we replicate that at a larger scale for as automated decision making grows and spreads.
So this seems to be at its root a kind of a thing, because we're going to be replacing the people making decisions with machines making decisions. You can argue with a person, but you can't argue with a machine. We can debate with a person and potentially sway them with the power of your debate. But a machine, you can't argue with a machine. So we need to have mechanisms to be able to step off the machine path into another path. So are you conceiving of it something like New South Wales government's AI assurance framework has this idea, if you're doing AI, you can put it off to a review body. Are you sort of contemplating something like that?
Yes, I think that would be a really positive thing to include, and to have opportunities for review for decisions, and to have those human conversations when they are important decisions which are going to have big impacts on people's lives.
So the other question that comes to my mind, could we even have in the future potentially have industry-wide? Like, why should everyone set up their own AI question group? But why don't the banking industry just have one? And why doesn't the higher education industry just have one? And then we don't have duplication across industries. So I think there's a lot more sophistication we could develop in this space.
Yeah, I think that could lead to a lot more fairness. I think there'd be interesting questions that would come up of, IP, and because a lot of these tools are proprietary, so how an external body, like a peak body for bank decision making, would then interact with the different flavors of tools that were being used across the banks. But no, that seems like almost like an administrative appeals tribunal, but for these automated decisions and making them industry specific, so you can get some perhaps consistency of decision making, which I think would lead to greater fairness.
So, you raised a point just there that a lot of these tools and their models are proprietary. So there are issues that they're kind of a black box that we can't look into. And so we can't even get insight into the tools. Is this something where we have an argument to even move into more an open source sort of direction for this kind of thing?
Possibly. And that's one of the other really interesting questions about explainability is we say explainable to whom, and how much knowledge is it reasonable to expect somebody to have in order to understand some of these tools and processes. It's certainly a discussion which has been happening in digital humanities scholarship. If, we can say, okay, well, the code's open source, but you still need a skill set to be able to interrogate that and to know what it means, and to be able to say, okay, that is the point at which I think, the data that you used was not fit for purpose, or the approach that you have used to analysing that data was not fit for purpose, and I think it's returning the wrong results for that reason. It's quite a complex conversation to have, and requires quite a lot of expert knowledge, really, to be able to interrogate those sorts of tools.
So we're obviously going to have to get better at this and find ways of doing it, because my mind's immediately going to some conversations we're having at the UNSW AI Institute at the moment, where some of the AI products that we're working with are so dense and so deep that it's actually really hard to unpack what's happening where in the entire model. So it's getting really complex really fast.
Yes, and I think we're seeing lots of new roles developing, and new skill sets being prioritized, and maybe AI explainer is going to be a job of the future, or a skill set of the future, that working out ways in which we can unpack some of these models, or if we accept that they're perhaps too dense and too complex to be able to deconstruct readily, where else you can have those intervention points.
It's kind of interesting. My mind is just in a flurry of all of the issues that we're going to confront in this space. And AI is already in the wild out there now in real life. And we've already got those examples from the US where they have developed models that predict criminality, and they're very heavily biased, to particular racial groups. But that's not actually because of the model. That's because of the underlying data that they use to predict. Because
absolutely, that populations of colour are already over-policed, so they are overrepresented in the data.
Yeah, and so it seems to me that we might need to go back and start to actually have a hard look at data sets to see, are they going, to develop better ways of analysing data sets to see if they will actually provide good inputs to a model. And I don't think we've got any good tools for that at the moment.
Yeah, I think having a better understanding of the data, where it came from, why it was collected, what's in there, is going to be incredibly important. And again, it's not something we're good at yet, but I think we're going to have to figure that out. And the other one is understanding fitness for purpose. So the case you've just referenced, the compass tool, my understanding was it was originally intended to predict the likelihood that somebody would be rearrested. And yes, in the US, Black people get arrested for existing, so the likelihood of arrest was much higher for those populations. But then they took this data and started to try and use it, as you said, to predict criminality and to make decisions about how long somebody's sentence should be, which the likelihood you will be arrested, it's a bit of a leap to then decide that because this model thinks that you are more likely to be arrested by police, you should therefore spend more time in jail now. So I think,
So asking the right questions, really understanding the implications of the questions you're asking. These are all not technical issues that we're talking about, though. These ones aren't. These are technical things.
So I think there are possibilities for great conversations about what data is in there, what is the tool intended to do, and what is it not intended to do, what would be a misuse of the tool. Those are questions which you absolutely don't need to be a hardcore AI engineer to be able to have.
And, this leads me to think about our own very favourite robo-debt, which was a very egregious thing that the Commonwealth government in Australia did, which was not AI. It was just bad business processes and badly implemented bad business processes that sought to monetize people in really evil ways. I think I was speaking out about it back in the day, but that was all happening without AI in the picture. There was limited amounts of automated decisioning in that. So it's entirely possible that you can do really, really bad things using bad principles without AI.
Yes, you do not need AI to make horrible decisions. And I have to say, following the Royal Commission, I was kind of expecting a story about algorithms gone wild. And that really wasn't the story that emerged. As you said, it was a story about horrible business practices. It was a story about leadership being alerted quite early on to the really terrible adverse effects of this program and choosing to push ahead with it anyway. And I think that's something which, when we talk about any sort of decision-making, or particularly automated decision-making, and particularly when it's affecting already vulnerable populations, is what checkpoints do you have? What needs to, at what point do we turn this thing off?
Yeah.
Is it when a frontline worker says, I think there are real risks that people are going to harm themselves. I think there are suicide risks coming out of this program. To me, that sounds like a really good moment to hit the big red stop button. So how do we make sure that there is a big red stop button on one of these programs?
That's the really big question that everybody needs to ask themselves before they implement anything is, how do we stop it? Because once things get going, they build their own momentum. And it gets, especially if people are using the outputs of it for secondary purposes, gets really hard to stop.
Yes, I think so.
You've worked in big corporates like I have. And, once things get momentum, it's very hard to stop. I remember once when I came in, there was a project that had been running a year and they asked me to review it. And I reviewed it and said, it needs to stop now. And they said, you cannot go and tell management that. And I'm like, it literally needs to stop.
Yeah. And I think particularly when, an attractive looking data set is coming out of a piece of work, telling people that they can't have it can also be tough. That we talk about, driving access and reuse of data and data as an asset. But it also means that we have to have those conversations where we say that's not what that data is for. It won't give you a useful answer. It will give you a wrong or misleading answer, or there's sensitive personal information in there, and you cannot use it for a secondary purpose. So having those, I guess, safeguards, those fences, and thinking about that at the outset. I think it's much easier, as you said, to say no up front than it is to stop something once it's started to get a little bit of a head of steam.
Yeah, it's really a fraught issue, because I know that we've discovered a number of things where people are using data that they've got for one purpose for another purpose, and they never want to give it up. And, we've had to embed that in our internal data sharing process so that we can stop them.
Yeah, I think higher education's a really interesting space that, because we do have so much personal information about staff and students and what they're doing. And there are we have lots of smart, creative people working in the sector who have, interesting speculations about what can they find out. And
just thinking about all the research data, there's every kind of data that you can imagine in the research space, as you know. So, and everybody is starting to think about using AI now. And I love how there's been some, what do they call it? I forget. It's where you basically use AI to generate data set, lookalike data sets.
Oh, synthetic data.
Synthetic data, that's what it's called. Yeah. So, and Toby Walsh tweeted the other day that this is not a good idea. Like, it's not a very good quality data set. I'm going to talk to him on the pod at some stage about this kind of thing. But there's all sorts of things that just because you can do them, you shouldn't do. So just what do you think of some of the key issues and risks that we need to start to think about as we go into this wonderful world of AI in the context of explainability?
I think Sarah, and I always stuff up her last name, Sarah Vochterbutcher's book, Technically Wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Technically Wrong is the book. And she talks about doing sort of stress tests on a use case and asking who is your most vulnerable user and how might this affect them. And I think that's a really good starting point, because it does get away from that need to, or that desire to interrogate an algorithm and have an argument about whether really k-means clustering was the appropriate approach in this case, and ask those questions about who are we worried about, and what could happen to them, and how will we know if these people are suffering from or experiencing adverse outcomes. What will tell us, what will the warning signs be, and what can we do about it if that does happen. So my workplace recently considered buying a facial verification technology, largely as an anti-spam measure. And there'd just been a story in the news about facial verification refusing a Maori man with facial tattoos, the moko, because it thought it thought he was wearing a mask. And so we had these questions about, okay, so the less you look like a cis white dude, the more an AI is going to struggle to identify your face. So how do we make sure that, how will we know if our non-white, non-cis presenting users are getting a worse outcome? What can we offer them in terms of recourse if they do get a bad outcome? What alternatives can we offer them to going through this process if you have people who are what I would call the security vegans and don't want to hand over their biometrics? So I think asking those questions up front before you even implement a tool like that gives you a better chance of building in that big red stop button.
It just made me think while you were talking about the data ethics canvas, which is such a good tool for asking those very sort of questions that I think are really, really important. I'll put the link in the show notes, but a data ethics canvas is a thing that's like the business canvas, where you ask a series of very simple questions on one page. And it encourages you to think about things like that, who is the most vulnerable person and things like that.
Yeah, I love the data ethics canvas, and it does encourage you to ask those questions about where is the data come from, what was it intended for, what might be in it or not in it that makes it better or worse for our proposed purpose. And I love it particularly because it prompts conversation, that there are some data ethics assessments out there where you tick boxes, or you pick a number on a Likert scale, and then it pops out a number at the bottom and says, if your score is over 10, don't do this. If your score is under 3, all good. But that just seems to me like you're almost automating the decision of whether you should use automated decision making, which
I know I like it because it forces you to have a conversation at the start of a project, and it helps you ask questions in the right categories. So for folks who are listening, it's from the Open Data Institute is the one I always use, and they're a good bunch of people who do sensible thinking around data. So I recommend, if you're looking for something to help you do this, go there. I'll make sure a link's in the show notes though. But I think that kind of thing, I think a lot of people just need to have a lot more conversations, is what I'm hearing.
I think so. And I think having diverse groups of people in the room. Having, your product people, as well as your technical data engineer people, having the people who can talk about who the users are and how we're expecting them to interact with a tool or how they might be affected by a tool, as well as the people who can talk about how it's going to operate and what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, totally agree about that. We're basically out of time. So thank you so much for your time, Fiona Tweedie. It's always a joy to talk to you and lovely to have you.
Thank you so much.
And that is it for another episode of the Data Revolution podcast. I'm Kate Carruthers. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to give the show a nice review and a like on your podcast app of choice. See you next time.